Hey fellow key shooter, welcome to this tutorial where we are going to have a look at this scene and more specific the caustics that you see here. It's not going to be a step-by-step tutorial on how to create the entire scene, but rather quick tips on how to achieve these kind of caustics without any trouble. If you want to have a look at the full scene, play with the model, or take a look at the layered Photoshop file that I've used to do the post-processing on this shot, you can go to my Gumroad shop through the link in the upper right corner and download it from there. This tutorial is made in collaboration with Render Weekly, the profile on Instagram that hosts weekly render challenges. I'm not going to dive in the physics and math behind caustics, but rather show some common examples. So this one here is quite typical. We have the glass, we have the sunlight hitting the glass, and then the light is being refracted through the glass and the liquid and focused into this caustic pattern hitting the ground plane or the floor in this case. It's also what you see on the bottom of your pool or maybe your cat's smart water tank. It's also used a lot in the jewelry industry where we have light being refracted and focused through the diamonds here. And also in cosmetic marketing shots, you'll see caustics used a lot to emphasize and highlight the colors and the glass used in the packaging. Here's another example, and caustics are not only caused by transparent materials, it's also caused by very glossy and reflective materials. So here we have reflected caustics from the metal parts on this packaging. And here's a really cool shot where we get the reflected caustics from the side of this car onto the ground. And I think a lot of product renderings in general could be made more visually interesting and actually also more realistic if caustics were integrated. When you start to look for it in real life, you'll start to see caustics everywhere. So it's something that you can integrate into your renderings to make them pop some more and make them more visually interesting and also more realistic, depending on what you are going for, of course. If we take a look at all these shots together, we can kind of establish some prerequisites for caustics. If we look at the materials here, we can see that they are either transparent or they are glossy and very reflective. So we have the glass, the liquid, and we have the glossy metal parts here on these cosmetics and on this car as well. Then we need the light to be intense and focused. When we take a look at the shadows in all these shots, we can see that they are quite sharp, meaning that the light source is small and intense. In the shots where it's a bit more soft, like in this one here and this one here, we also see that the caustics are less defined. So if you want this very defined and very focused type of caustics, you need your light source to be very small and intense. And at last, we need something for the caustics to be projected on. So here in this case, it's the ground plane, the same for the car. Yeah, actually in all these shots. And this shot here as well, we have the wall where the caustics are projected to. With these things in mind, let's jump into KeyShot and get some caustics going. Here inside KeyShot, I have the bottle imported and I have some basic materials set up already. And I've made sure to have both transparent materials and reflective materials, as we just discovered is needed to generate caustics. In particular, we have the glass part with a dielectric material and an orange transmission color. Inside that, we have the liquid. That is a liquid material type with a hint of green in the color. And then we have the metal plate here with the logo on, and it's just a metal type with a colored appearance. Before going into the lighting and surroundings and everything, there's one important thing to enable in KeyShot before we move on. And it's in the project panel under the lighting tab. By default, the lighting preset is set to basic, and we can see if we go a bit down that we have this caustics checkbox and it's disabled, meaning that we are not going to see any caustics no matter what we do. we need to enable this, and actually we also need some global illumination, and we probably also need some ground illumination, and we probably also need some more ray bounces. You see, as I turn these up, we start to see some kind of caustics here on the ground. So we need to turn everything on and bump up the ray bounces. Instead of doing this manually, you can also go ahead and hit this jewelry lighting preset, and it's pretty much set up for you already. If you have some specific needs, you can always go ahead and change that and save it as a custom lighting preset. But for now, the jewelry preset will do. So even though we don't have any elements for the caustics to be projected to, we can already see it a bit. And it's because the ground plane, or the default ground plane in KeyShot, picks it up as well. But in my experience, you get better looking results if you add in an actual ground plane, and you also need to do that if you want to add some material to your ground plane. So in this case, I have a ground plane and also a wall that I want to project the caustics onto. And you can see here in the geometry view that you can hide and show by hitting the geometry view button up here, or hit O on the keyboard. Yeah, we can see that it's just two rectangular planes and nothing else. The material on these at the moment are a diffuse material type with just a gray color. Same for the floor, it's just a bit darker. You probably noticed when I turned these on that our caustics kind of disappeared, and it's because they are at the moment blocking the lighting that generates the caustics. If I go to the environment tab in the project panel, you will see that we have our default startup environment, and it's quite contrastless, and we don't have any small intense sources of light that we need, as we discovered just before. I can go ahead and create a new environment here, and I can try and go to the HDRI editor, add in a pin, make it small, maybe a radius of 5, and then make it really bright, so maybe 250 in brightness, and I can enable this aim or set highlight option and drag it over here, and now we start to see the caustics. Pretty nice. So you can definitely use the HDRI to generate caustics, but in this case I want to use a spotlight because I want to add a stencil to create my composition, and in my experience the caustics also renders a bit faster using the physical lights, so either a spotlight or an area light. Also, when using the physical lights, you get a bit more dynamic feel to the shot because you get a more visible fall off depending on the direction of the lighting. So let's go ahead and do that instead. Instead of using this environment, I'm going to use this one I have set up already with a desaturated dark blue background and just a small rectangular pin for adding a bit of depth to the glass material here. So you can see if I turn it off, we lose that reflection here, here, and here, and it just adds a bit of depth to the shape of this glass. As said, for this shot, I have a spotlight I want to use, so let me turn that on, and you see right away how we get these really nice caustics, both the refracted ones from the light going through the glass and the liquid, and we also have the reflected ones coming off this logo badge, and you can see it here on the ground. And where we have the dark areas from the logo, we don't have anything, so we get this really cool effect on the ground. The spotlight is a sphere that I added in from the edit add geometry menu, and then I applied a spotlight material to it. And in this case, the power is set to 16. We have a beam angle of 70 to make sure that it covers the entire scene like that. And fall off is 0.1, radius is 0.2, just to have a tiny hint of softness on the edge here. So if you wanted it to be more soft, you could bump this up. That might be too much. Maybe 5 centimeters. And as the shadow becomes softer, you also see that the caustics becomes more soft. So again, if you want the clearly defined caustics, make sure that your radius of your light source is small. If I go here in the geometry view, select my spotlight, right click and say move selection, and go ahead and pick the glass as the pivot point, like that. You can see how the caustics updates almost in real time as I move this around. And you can really quickly fine-tune your composition of your caustics and how they should look. And how everything changes depending on the angle of this source of light. So there's a lot of fun doing that. But let me jump back to my previous setting. I like this setup here. One thing I want to mention here as well is that caustics are also affected by bump maps. So if I zoom in here on the glass and right click and select it first, right click and select edit material graph, we can see that we have two bump maps at the moment, and what I want to show is particularly this brushed one here that I have just going around the glass to give it a bit of imperfection, making it look a bit more realistic. But if we take a look at the caustic here as well, let me turn on the region view. So we utilize all the CPU power just for this area. We can see that if we take the bump height for that down to 0, that the caustics will also be more perfect. And if I take the bump height up to 1, we can see how the caustics are now way more distorted. So if you lack detail in your caustics, you can try and go ahead and add bump maps to your materials and see what kind of effects you can create. Of course, right now it's way too much when we look at the glass, but just having something subtle as 0.1 will also help to give a bit of interest to your caustics. Or maybe a bit more realism. Again, all depending on your specific scene and needs. So this is all good. Let me go to my camera view here and select my pre-set up main camera with a tiny bit of depth of field. And let me update the environment. So this is telling you that some changes has been made to this environment and it's using a low-res version. So just to see everything in the full resolution, make sure to update this one. And here we go. We have our shot and we have some pretty interesting caustics. If I go to the render settings, give this a name and put it in a specific folder, I'll output this as PSD 16-bit. And for now, I don't want to include anything. I just want to show you that once I go to options, set a quality, when using the interior lighting mode, so when you pick jewelry, it will also pick the interior mode, and that also renders caustics faster than the product mode. So make sure that you also use interior mode. And as said, it's automatically selected when you pick the jewelry preset. But when you have interior mode, you can only use maximum samples or maximum time. So let's pick maximum samples. And in my experience, around 500 samples is needed to get nice and smooth looking caustics. So if I hit render in background, you will see that it looks quite nice. So in the beginning, we have a lot of splotches up here and on the side here, but once it gets time to rest up a bit more, these will eventually disappear. It's not a big problem at all. These will go away with more samples. Easy peasy, right? But this scene is also quite simple. We only have diffuse materials on the wall and the ground plane. Once you start to have a bit more complex materials, or if you have large areas that have a material that has some reflectivity to it, in my experience, you will get trouble with caustic splotches all over, no matter how long it gets to render. And let me demonstrate that. So let me stop this one, and I don't want to save it, so I just stop. All right. So let's see what happens if we add some more interesting materials to our wall and ground. Here for the ground plane, I have prepared a material, a plastic material with full specularity and with some roughness and bump maps. If we take a look at the material graph, it looks like this down here. So just a single bump map and a single roughness map, but it will look a bit more interesting, like some kind of concrete surface. For the wall, I have also prepared one textured one. And again, if I open up the material graph, we can see that it's one with a bump map, a roughness map, and also a subtle displacement map for just adding a bit of depth or variation of the depth to that completely flat plane. And already now you start to see some trouble. We can see that we get these splotches all over the scene. So if I go ahead to the render options and select render in background once again, we can see that we now have way more splotches scattered around the scene. And maybe if you let it rest up for a crazy amount of samples, it will be good, but in my experience, it's not really feasible. So what to do when you get these kind of problems? And this is a very common issue with the caustics. There's no direct way to fix this, but by doing a kind of workaround, you can make it work quite well. So let's go ahead and have a look at that. So in this shot, besides having these materials on the wall and the ground, I also want to have a brushed material on the logo badge. So I'll double click on that and take my brushed preset material here. And when that one is loaded in, you'll see that we lose our reflection or the caustics here on the ground. And actually I kind of want to keep that. So we can also see how we can get that back through the workaround. Another thing I want to do is to add a stencil to my spotlight, so we have just this defined square of light. I go into my spotlight material and select the one with stencil, as you see here. Only thing that I have done to this one compared to this one here is that I have added this rectangular texture and positioned it to only show the spotlight in this specific area. What we see here as well is that even though we still get all these caustic splotches, we don't see the caustics coming from the glass. And for this time being, there are a bug, I guess, in KeyShot, where with this blend width color is set to black, you don't get the caustics. If I turn it up to white, you see we get them, but then also the effect is kind of, it doesn't really make sense. I mean, this could be cool, but I want this in this example. So what are we going to do here as well? And again, the same workaround that we are going to use for getting rid of these splotches will also work for getting these caustics back. So this is the main lighting I want to have in my scene. So the default model set, I have renamed that to main. To show your model sets, you either pick this or these two arrows in the upper left corner of the scene tree, or you can take these three dots here, left click and drag it to the side. What we want to do is to create a version of the scene that contains our lighting and material as we want them, and then we want to create another version that will generate the caustics that we are going to need. You can do this in a couple of different ways, either with multi-materials that I have already and studios, or with model sets. When you do it with model sets, you get the option to change the position of the lighting or maybe add in more light sources to generate the caustics without having them interfering with the main lighting of your scene. So depending on how complex you want to do this mixing, you want to go with either model sets or studios or maybe a combination. In this case, we're just going to do another model set. So I make sure I have my main one selected, and then I hit this add model set. And I call this main / caustic pass. So I know it's the caustic pass for the main model set. I don't want to link materials. I want to be able to add some other materials to these surfaces. And I want to include these 4 parts. That looks good. So I hit OK. So here in the caustics pass, because I made sure to unlink the materials, I can go back to my original spotlight here. So yeah, so right now I'm changing the spotlight material for the one in the main. I have to make sure to double click this new spotlight. You can see that it's number 1. So I can select this plane without the stencil and get my caustics back here. I will also pick my ground and wall, and I can change that back to the diffuse. But what I usually do when I don't have any, if I didn't have any multi-material set up, is to open up the material library by hitting M on the keyboard and search for a diffuse and pick this interior diffuse and put it on all the parts that doesn't contribute to the caustics. So in this case, we have the plate here, we have the, and most of the bottle actually, generating caustics, but I don't want to get the caustics from the ground and the wall. And this is the problem at the moment, that the reflection or the reflectivity we have from this ground and wall are causing all these splotches that will never res up. So I take the diffuse and add to the ground plane and the wall. Just like that. And now you see how it already looks way better. And then again, I also wanted to have the reflected caustics from this piece here, and I also want to keep the brushed material finish. But if I go back to the main model set, I have the brushed finish here. So in the caustic pass model set, I can do whatever I need to do to get the caustics I want. So I can pick this one, the plate material, by double clicking on it and selecting the polished version. And it takes a bit of time due to the fact that I have displace mapped the Render Weekly logo. But once we have the polished version again, we see that we get that on the floor. The trick now is to render the caustic pass with the caustic turned on and render the main pass with the caustics turned off. If I go to the main model set and go to the lighting tab here and make sure to uncheck caustics, we get this. It's looking pretty nice, so let me go ahead and render that. I select my render menu. I go to the output settings and make sure to call this one main. I will save it as a PSD 16-bit, and I don't want to add anything here, so maybe the clown pass and add to PSD so it's all collected in the same Photoshop file. I want to render 500 samples, that's good, so let me add that to the queue. Yeah, so I have already output this, so it asked me if I want to overwrite, and I don't want that right now, so let me just call this one main tutorial and add to queue. Then I go ahead and select my main caustics pass, and now we don't see any caustics because we have disabled it here. So I make sure to enable it or pick the jewelry lighting preset. And the important thing here is now to use the same settings. Let me call this caustic pass. And then in the Photoshop file, we want to include caustics as a separate pass. So we have that on its own layer. We also want to include reflection and refraction because we can use that in the post-processing process to enhance the look of the glass and the liquid. No need to output the clown again. We have that already. So with this set up and 500 samples for this as well, I'm going to add this to the queue. I can go and take a look that we have these two setups here. the one with the main look, with the main materials and the main lighting, and then the caustic pass just for generating the caustic. Now I'm going to output that, and then in Photoshop I will be able to combine these two into one coherent shot. So let's go ahead and do that. My two shots finished rendering and I have opened them up in Photoshop. I have the main PSD, as you see here, just a single layer with the main lighting. And then we have this caustic pass PSD with the RGB output, of course. And then we also have this folder with render passes containing the refraction, the reflection, and the caustic pass. And what we want to do is to grab these three and Control C, copy them, and Control V, paste them into this shot here. And that's actually all we need for the caustic pass. We can now go ahead and close it down. And just for your information, these two raw outputs are also included in the file that you can download on my Gumroad site. Let's close down the caustic pass and work with the file here. If we take a look at the caustics, they are looking quite dark at the moment. And we don't really see anything of the original shot beneath. What we need to do here is to select the layer and go to the blending modes and pick one of these in this group here. So either lighten, screen, color dodge, linear dodge, or lighter color. There's no specific rule for what you have to pick, but I find that the linear dodge probably is the one that makes the most sense for putting your caustics on top of your original shot. So when I do that, we can see that we get our caustics without any issues or artifacts whatsoever. It is a bit faint though, but what we can do is to select the caustics layer and simply hit Ctrl J to copy it and to make it look a bit more bright. Another thing you could do, sometimes it's looking really dark, is to select the caustics layer, go to filter and add a camera raw filter to it. And inside that, you can go ahead and play with the exposure and the highlight and white sliders to get all the details out. But be very careful not to overdo it, so it's kind of burning out and you lose details. Do this very subtle if you want to do it this way. In my case, if possible, creating these multiple copies will yield a more naturally looking effect. And to clean up your layer stack a bit, you can select all your caustic passes and hold down Shift while clicking this folder button to group them into one folder. And let's call this caustics. And then you can of course go ahead and adjust the fill or the opacity, and if you want to make it less visible or more visible. In this case, I want to tone down this reflected caustic a bit because it's actually a bit unrealistic due to the fact that brushed materials don't reflect these kind of focused caustics. But I like to have it for the effect. Let me add a layer mask to the folder, the caustics folder, by hitting the layer mask button. And I can take a black brush. Let me make it soft, quite big. Let me take the flow down maybe to 30 and let me zoom out, and then I can just draw on top of that just to fade it out a bit, but still have it very subtle in the scene. So this is not related to the caustics directly, but I can go ahead and do the same for the reflection. Maybe if I want to make those a bit more visible, like that. And the refraction as well. Take that, change the blending mode to, I don't know, maybe screen. See how that makes the liquid a bit more glowing, or the glass. That's actually all there is to it. Now you have full control over your caustics. You can hide them if you regret and don't want to have any caustics. You can turn them on. You can do local changes just to the caustics, and that's super cool to have when art directing your final shot. All there is left to do is to do the rest of your typical post-processing process, and I have done that in this file here called main_post, and it's also included in the download in the file that you can grab on the Gumroad shop if you want to have a look at all these layers and what they add to the final appearance. And that's all for this tutorial. I hope that it will help you to create some cool looking product shots with caustics in them. If you use these tips for your Render Weekly challenge submission, feel free to tag me and I would love to give it a look and see what you create using this tutorial. And as always, like and subscribe if you want to see more content like this in the future. And until next time, take care.